First of all, we had an extremely tight post-production schedule. The movie was green-lit based upon being in the theatres by a certain date. So our post-production schedule was less than 6 months, which on a film of this magnitude in terms of visual effects is a very dangerous thing. So we went to our first test and we had a lot of horrific, gory sequences in there. The maggots around the legs, JD being skinned alive. And what we found was the audience just couldn't, it was just too much. It undermined the drama. Now, they were also watching a film that did not have complete visual effects. Because the schedule was so tough, we couldn't test it with a complete bunch of visual effects. We then cut those sequences out of the film. We also changed the ending a number of times, and that was the film that was released.
We cut a lot of scenes from the final version of the film, partly because we had a very difficult post-production period on the movie. The post-production period was always going to be short, but as a director you have a guaranteed 10-week director's cut, which is guaranteed by the Directors Guild of America. But you can waive that if the studio put enough pressure on you, and this was one of the cases where the studio, they wanted the movie, they were desperate to release the movie, they were excited about it, they were saying all the right things to me, so I said, kind of in my naivety, that I would shorten the director's cut from 10 weeks to 6 weeks. And then what happened was, because I was also directing the second unit, we continued to shoot wire work and zero gravity work. After the main unit wrapped, I shot for another 2 weeks with the second unit. So officially, my director's cut had been going on for 2 weeks, even though I was still on the stage shooting. So when it came down to it, I really only had 4 weeks to assemble the movie before we showed it to the studio. And then they also had the idea that the first time they would see the film, we would also do an audience test screening. So 4 weeks to assemble a movie as complicated as Event, with all the visual effects, with all the kind of hell sequences that had to be very finely cut, because it's those visions of hell are lots of 2, 1, 3 frame cuts, which take forever. It was a huge amount of work to do in 4 weeks, and frankly we didn't manage to do it. So the movie was overly long, and it wasn't in great shape. Some of the scenes weren't polished very well. There was bits of bad performance, there was bits of bad direction, all those things that you normally take out into 10 weeks, we didn't have time to do in 4 weeks. And added to which, we had to test in America. So we had to fly the movie over there because we were doing post in London. And we mixed the sound for the film the night before we flew to America. And the mixing studio we were in, basically broke down. So we couldn't finish the sound mix properly. So we went there with a movie that was, wasn't edited properly. The sound mix was bad. And in a horror movie, I mean, it's the classic thing, but if you turn the volume down on any scary movie, it's not scary anymore. I mean, you can sit through any scary scene, and if you don't have the music and you don't have the sound effects and you don't have the build, it just doesn't frighten you. So all of those things conspired to mean that the first test screening we had of Event was just disastrous. It didn't go well at all. And in that situation, I think the studio reaction is always, when you have a movie that doesn't really work, the first instinct is to push the filmmakers to cut the film down, make it shorter, make it faster, just get it over with, so the audience don't have to sit through. I think the first cut was just over 2 hours. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes. And they were like, you have to take half an hour out of it, it's got to be shorter, and we did that. It was really my first studio film that I'd done where we'd had a bad test. Mortal Kombat, we had good tests on, the audience really liked it. This was the first time I'd kind of walked into a room of 350 people. They watched the movie, and at the end they just didn't like it. Or some people liked it passionately, but not enough. So we cut the film, and I think again, because we're on a very tight post-production period, we had to go back to America a week later and test the movie again. And if you only have a week, it's very hard to make rational, well thought out decisions. So I think we went from one end of the spectrum where the movie was too long, undoubtedly, and then we cut it, and then I think it became too short. And then the release of the film was looming, and we ended up releasing that version of the movie. And I think that was a big mistake, because I felt there were definitely very good scenes that weren't quite reaching their potential, but could have done if we'd had more time to work on them. but because the studio were adamant on releasing the movie on a certain date, we just never had time to really fix the film. And the scenes we cut out were primarily as well related to kind of the visions of hell, the experiences that the crew of the Lewis and Clark had on the Event Horizon. And there was a terrific sequence that Andrew Kevin Walker wrote, who wrote Seven, and he came in at one point to do a polish on the screenplay. And he wrote this great sequence where the crew of the Lewis and Clark have just come through the airlock in the Event Horizon the first time, and they see everything floating in zero gravity. They see ice crystals, they see a wrench floating, they see a watch floating. And then Fishburne sees something, and he walks up to it. And it was framed, so he didn't quite know how big it was, because whatever it was in the foreground, and he was in the background. So he thought it was something quite big. But as he got closer and closer, he realized it was something quite small, till eventually he could get it in his fingers like that. And what you realized was, and Sam Neill and Jolie were looking at it on the monitors, and Jason Isaacs were looking at it, trying to see what it was, and it was a tooth that had been ripped out by the root. So you had the tooth, you had the whole root of the tooth, and you had a bit of gum attached to it as well. So it's just like someone had ripped it out with a pair of pliers. And it was a truly disturbing image. But it took a long time to play that scene out. And it was one of the scenes that kind of bit the dust, and I was always very sorry about that. Because did it progress the plot at all? No, it didn't. And that's the reason why it came out as well, because the pressure was make the film shorter, get on with it. And it didn't progress the plot, which was the studio's reasoning for taking it out. For me, though, it was truly disturbing, and it kind of informed their exploration of the event, and I think would have unsettled the audience even more. Although, in retrospect, the audience was so unsettled anyway. They were terrified when our heroes were exploring the Event Horizon. But I feel that scene was one that we lost, that I always wanted to put back in again.
Paul and I personally feel we didn't have enough time to really fix it. We think if we'd completed the visual effects, the film might have been better with some of the gory stuff left in, and we wish we'd had enough time to fix the ending. We went into the movie with a script that worked up until the last third.
The other scene that was heavily trimmed was what happened to the original crew of the Event Horizon. There was a whole kind of big, violent, kind of bloody orgy scene that was shot where essentially the crew were they were having sex, but they were also murdering each other while they were doing it. So they're kind of like fucking each other to death. And it was pretty bloody and unpleasant. And I was actually helped by another filmmaker friend of mine who's another director who came in to direct Second Unit a couple of times, called Vadim Jean, who's probably know from he's done a lot of kind of romantic comedies like Leon the Pig Farmer, but he clearly has a dark side to him, because when I brought him in, because I'd started shooting these sequences and then I kind of ran out of time. I had to go back to the main unit, so he came in and he shot a lot of the kind of violent orgiastic scenes.
There's been discussions of the visions of hell sequences. They had to be cut. Essentially, they're sequences of orgiastic, perverse sexuality, violence. It's very much like Hieronymus Bosch or the photography of Vidkin. I'll give you an example, but a man ramming his forearm, his fist down his mouth, ripping out his innards. There was nothing sexy about this. This is extremely dark. It is hell. It is basically things that are normally pleasurable, they're being flipped, so they're absolutely horrific. That's what the ship is. That's what we're saying the ship is taking you to. It's the inverse of what is pleasurable. It is the most painful. Obviously, some people might get pleasure from that pain, but that wasn't the idea behind it. And I really think there's a much stronger cut with some of those sequences in. Because I think at the end of the day, if you understood and accepted the idea behind the film, then those sequences would not come across as gratuitous. It's very difficult in a film which deals with hell and the devil to know how to present hell and the devil, because everybody has their specific idea of what hell and the devil is. we did it in two ways. We basically showed you the hell of guilt when you torture yourself because you feel you did these things to these people and how that eats you out from the inside. And then we just gave people hard and horrific glimpses of, as I said, these orgiastic, destructive scenes. I mean, there's a great moment where Fishburne is terrified and exhausted, and he leans his head against the ship, and he goes, bang! You get this sudden vision, and he goes, fuck, this thing knows it's living, it's a sentient being. It knows what I'm thinking. It's going to really screw with me. So you get a sense of something much more powerful than you are, and yet it knows everything that is in your mind.
There was also a lot of the visions of hell were cut very short. We spent a long time shooting them. I would work with the main unit all week, and then on the weekends I would also direct the second unit. So I was essentially working 7-day weeks. And over the weekends we'd bring in the occasional cast member like Jolie and spend half a day shooting particular visions of them. And we'd shoot at different frame rates. We'd shoot into mylar mirrors. Mylar is a very reflective material that's very flexible. So it's like having a mirror, but a mirror you can bend and flex and warp, or you can tap it and it kind of wobbles in a strange way. So what we do is we wouldn't shoot things directly, we'd shoot them through the mylar mirror so that we could warp and bend the images. Just to kind of give it a kind of disturbing feel. And we did some quite experimental stuff. I mean, I was really kind of playing at the weekends, shooting all of this stuff. And we used a phenomenal amount of blood and prosthetics. And a lot of that stuff, again, partly because the studio thought the movie was repetitious, there was pressure to take it out. And also partly because I think the studio were shocked at how bloody the movie was. I think they never really anticipated the film being as brutal and as bloody and frankly as disturbing as the finished film turned out. And we were shooting the visions of hell very much, you know, the middle towards the end of the schedule. At a point when the studio was very happy with the film, they'd seen the dailies, they knew they had some good performances, they knew it looked great. But then when they saw it assembled, they were just shocked. So there was a lot of pressure to take that out. Just because they thought it was too disturbing, it was going to marginalize the audience the movie could have had. Orbital had done a track for me for Shopping, my first film. And then I loved the track so much, I then used it on my second movie, Mortal Kombat. And that was a source track. It was off one of their albums, existing already. So by the time I got to my third movie, and I liked their music so much, I felt, you know, we should really get them involved in terms of